It started with a glance, a quick, dismissive look from behind polished glass and Italian suits. No one had to say anything at first. The body language spoke loudly enough. Conor McGregor walked into a Ferrari dealership, and instead of being welcomed, he was silently weighed, measured, and, in the eyes of the store owner, dismissed. Why? Not because he was loud or unruly. Not because he didn't belong there financially, but simply because he was Irish and didn't look like someone who should be buying a Ferrari. For anyone who has ever felt out of place, misunderstood, or outright disrespected based on where they're from or how they speak, this moment resonates. And it cuts deep. It's not just about a luxury car or a flashy name. It's about something more primal, the need to be seen, not just looked at. The need to be treated with basic dignity no matter what stereotypes people carry in their minds. Discrimination isn't always loud or violent. Sometimes it's subtle, quiet, wearing a suit and holding a clipboard. It smiles politely while making up its mind about you before you've even said a word. And in those moments, the sting is sharper. Because what's being questioned isn't your money, your achievements, or your actions. What's being judged is your very identity. This wasn't about McGregor's fame. The owner didn't even recognize him. This was about the invisible wall that still exists in many corners of the world. The belief that certain accents, faces, or flags belong in certain places and not in others. That deep-rooted narrative that tells us, you are not enough, not here, not like this. If you're over 45 in the US, you've likely seen this happen in different forms. Maybe at work, maybe at school drop-off. Maybe in a quiet corner of a restaurant where someone assumed something about you, your intelligence, your values, your wealth, just by how you looked or sounded. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of that judgment, you know how deeply it lingers. The Ferrari store moment is a symbol, a spotlight, a truth many would prefer to ignore. Because to acknowledge it would mean acknowledging our collective complicity. How often we assume before we understand. It would mean admitting that sometimes, without even knowing it, we too have been the ones glancing sideways, deciding who belongs and who doesn't. If this reflection has already touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share in the comments. What part spoke to you the most? Now let's continue. There's a silent expectation in elite spaces, one that says, if you're going to be rich, at least look the part. It's an unspoken rule rooted in classism, snobbery, and cultural conditioning. And when someone like Conor McGregor walks into a high-end showroom, dressed in a way that doesn't match those assumptions, the system malfunctions. It doesn't matter that he could buy 10 Ferraris. What matters to some is that he doesn't fit the mold. In the United States, we're no strangers to this illusion. For decades, we've glamorized a particular type of wealth, understated old money, Ivy League approved. But wealth doesn't just wear loafers and drive quietly. Sometimes it wears tattoos, sometimes it speaks with an accent, sometimes it grew up poor, learned how to fight and worked for every inch of progress. And yet, when that kind of wealth walks into the room, it's still seen as less than. This reveals a deeper discomfort in our culture. We say we value success, but only if it conforms to our idea of respectability. And that idea is often rooted in outdated exclusionary ideals. We still confuse refinement with worth. We still judge success not just by what someone has, but by how well they carry it, according to someone else's standards. And so, people like McGregor, who built their lives outside the traditional blueprint, are often reminded, in subtle ways, that they're not quite invited into these elite circles. The Ferrari store owner didn't just make a mistake. He revealed a prejudice, a belief that Irishness, or perhaps working-class energy or non-conformity, doesn't belong in a space built on opulence. But this is where psychology steps in. Because behind this moment is a deeper fear that the boundaries between us and them are dissolving, that the old gatekeepers are losing control. That wealth and influence are no longer passed down, they're being claimed. And that makes people deeply uncomfortable. If you're in your 50s or 60s in America, you've likely witnessed this cultural shift. Maybe your kids don't act like success should look. Maybe you felt judged for not wearing the right clothes or using the right words. Maybe you've sensed that strange tension, where people welcome your money but not always your story. The truth is, wealth has changed, but our perception of it hasn't. And until it does, moments like this will keep happening. Not because people are evil, but because they're still clinging to an old world that's already slipping away. Prejudice isn't born, it's learned. Layer by layer, through observation, conditioning, and silent agreements we never question. By the time we're adults, we've absorbed 1,000 invisible rules about who is safe, who is refined, who is trustworthy, and just as dangerously, who is not. The Ferrari store owner didn't need to say, "You don't belong." His nervous glances, his dismissive tone, his reluctance to engage, they spoke volumes. But what's fascinating is that he likely didn't even realize it was prejudice. In his mind, he may have thought he was protecting the brand or upholding standards. That's how bias often hides, behind good intentions. Social psychology calls this implicit bias, unconscious attitudes that influence how we behave, even if we claim not to be prejudiced. And implicit bias doesn't only apply to race or gender. It can apply to class, nationality, accent, even posture. In McGregor's case, the man wasn't reacting to a celebrity. He was reacting to an Irishman who didn't look or act like his mental image of a Ferrari buyer. In the US, many of us have been trained to associate wealth with calm, whiteness with authority, and formality with intelligence. We may not believe these ideas consciously, but they linger in our responses, in who we trust, who we promote, who we fear. This is why prejudice persists in sophisticated environments. It doesn't scream, it whispers. But here's the harder truth. Prejudice is often a mirror. The judgments we pass on others say far more about our fears and insecurities than they do about the other person. If someone triggers our discomfort, it's usually because they challenge a part of us we've suppressed. Maybe they remind us of something we once were, or someone we were told not to be. In McGregor, the dealership owner may have seen chaos, rebellion, noise, traits that don't belong in the pristine world of luxury cars. But what if those traits, resilience, boldness, defiance, are exactly what built the world he's trying to protect? For those of us reflecting in midlife, it's worth asking, what unconscious rules are still shaping how we treat people? Have we inherited ideas we never stopped to question? And who might we be silently excluding, not out of hate, but out of habit? Prejudice isn't always loud, but when we trace it back, it always has roots, in history, in family, in fear. And only by confronting those roots can we truly move forward. There's a strange kind of gift hidden inside being underestimated. It doesn't feel like a gift when it happens. It feels humiliating, infuriating, like your very existence is being questioned. But sometimes when someone writes you off too quickly, they give you a moment of clarity. They don't see me, and that's their weakness, not mine. Conor McGregor knows this feeling intimately. So do many immigrants, working-class individuals, and people who grew up in neighborhoods far from privilege. When you walk into a room and are immediately sized up, dismissed for your accent, your name, your clothes, you either shrink or sharpen. And McGregor, he sharpened. In American culture, we often celebrate underdog stories, but we forget how brutal those stories really are. Being underestimated is a chronic pressure. It means having to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. It means being told no before you even open your mouth, and it means constantly proving that you belong, not once but every single day. If you're over 45, you've likely faced this at some point. Maybe you were told you were too emotional to lead, too quiet to succeed, too ethnic, too female, too unpolished. Or maybe you watched someone you love get passed over, not because of what they lacked, but because of what someone else refused to see. Being underestimated forces you to cultivate something rare, inner authority, the kind that says, "I know who I am, even if you don't." That's what McGregor brought into that dealership, whether the owner saw it or not. The strength to stand tall in spaces that were never designed with you in mind. The dignity to know your worth, even when others refuse to acknowledge it. There's also something psychologically liberating about not being recognized. When people don't expect much from you, they don't see you coming. They leave space for you to move freely, disrupt the narrative, flip the script. In that sense, being underestimated isn't just a challenge, it's an opportunity. But it takes emotional resilience to respond with strength instead of shame. It takes maturity to say, your perception of me is not my responsibility. And it takes wisdom to know that sometimes the people who look down on you are only revealing the smallness of their own worldview. McGregor walked out of that dealership with his dignity intact, because being underestimated again and again had already prepared him to rise above moments like this. The question is, are we prepared to do the same? A Ferrari isn't just a car. It's a statement, a status symbol, a gleaming, roaring declaration that says, I made it. And in many ways, that's exactly what makes this story so revealing. Because when someone is denied entry to that symbol, not by law, but by perception, the emotional impact runs deeper than we often admit. For centuries, societies have used symbols like clothing, vehicles, homes, and titles to mark status. In the US, this is especially powerful. The American dream itself is laced with visible achievement. We don't just want success, we want to be seen as successful. And for those who come from working-class roots or immigrant families, the desire to enter those elite spaces isn't always about vanity. It's about finally being allowed to exhale. It's about belonging. But the cruel irony is that even when you arrive, the gatekeepers may still look at you like you wandered into the wrong room. You can have the money, the name, the credentials, but if you don't match their internal image of what success should look like, they hesitate, they question, they deny. This hits especially hard for those of us in midlife, people who have worked for decades, sacrificed time with family, built careers from nothing, only to find that social validation doesn't always come with the paycheck. You reach a certain age, and you realize there's a difference between having status and being accepted. And this opens up a deeper psychological question. Why do we crave these symbols in the first place? At our core, we want to be seen, to be valued, to be welcomed into spaces that once felt off-limits. That Ferrari, in that moment, wasn't just a luxury vehicle. It represented decades of struggle, fights in and out of the ring, proving something, not just to the world, but to himself. When that kind of recognition is denied, it can feel like your whole journey is being invalidated, as if all the work, all the transformation, still wasn't enough. It stings, not because you need their approval, but because part of you hoped the world had evolved more than this. So many people in the US have experienced this in their own way, being the only woman in the boardroom, being the first in the family to own property, being told even subtly you're lucky to be here, as if you didn't earn every step. Status symbols are never just about the object, they're about the emotional weight we attach to being accepted. And when that acceptance is withheld, even for a moment, it reveals just how fragile and conditional our social systems still are. To the Ferrari store owner, McGregor wasn't a global sports icon, he was just an Irishman. And in that instant, that identity was all that mattered. Not his success, not his wealth, not his legacy, just the cultural stereotype attached to his nationality. And this raises an uncomfortable truth. National identity still shapes how we're treated, even in supposedly global spaces. Being Irish in certain circles still carries historical baggage. Stereotypes about temperament, class, behavior, or refinement, some rooted in old colonial narratives, others in media cliches. In Europe and America alike, many still harbor subconscious beliefs about who the Irish are based not on reality, but on caricature. McGregor doesn't fit the passive mold of how people expect civilized wealth to behave. He's intense, proud, unfiltered, and for some, that's threatening, because it challenges the notion that to be successful, you must also be subdued, polite, polished, deferential. Traits that were historically associated with upper-class British or American sensibilities. But why is this still happening in 2025? Because the way we think about nationality hasn't caught up with the way the world actually works. In multicultural societies like the US, people still associate certain accents with ignorance, certain passports with danger, and certain foreign behaviors with discomfort. We talk about diversity, but we often reward assimilation. For many Americans over 45, this is familiar territory. You might remember when having a foreign accent meant fewer job offers, or when teachers mispronounced your name over and over, or when your parents were told to speak English at home. National identity was never neutral. It shaped your access, your credibility, and your dignity. McGregor's experience is a reminder that even now those judgments persist, that the way you sound can still close doors, that someone's first assumption about where you're from can erase everything you've done. And for anyone who has ever been flattened into a stereotype, the pain is real. Not just because it's unfair, but because it robs you of your full story. But here's the truth. The discomfort that people feel around strong cultural identity is not about the person being judged. It's about the person doing the judging. It reveals their rigidity, their fear, their unwillingness to expand their image of what success and humanity looks like. And in that way, McGregor's Irishness wasn't the problem, it was the invitation. An invitation for that store owner, and for all of us, to break our mental molds and begin seeing people for who they are, not where they're from. Gatekeeping is never just about protecting quality. It's about protecting identity. The Ferrari brand has long positioned itself as an exclusive club, and exclusivity always needs a bouncer, someone who decides who gets in and who stays out. But here's the truth about that kind of power. It often attracts the fragile ego, the kind that feels stronger when others are made to feel smaller. The store owner's behavior wasn't just prejudice, it was also ego, the subtle rush of being the one in control, of assuming the role of cultural curator, of deciding with a smirk or a nod whether someone deserves to own something that costs more than most people's homes. This dynamic, the ego of gatekeeping, is everywhere. In academia, in art, in elite professions, in country clubs and private schools and luxury brands. The people who enforce the boundaries aren't always the most powerful, but they get a taste of that power when they reject others. It's not about the car, it's about the hierarchy. Psychologically, this speaks to something deeper, the fear of losing status, of becoming irrelevant. As wealth becomes more diverse and influence becomes more democratized, traditional gatekeepers feel threatened. They sense that they're no longer the only ones at the table, and so they tighten the rules, invent new standards, act as if refinement can be measured in posture and pitch. This is where people like McGregor shake the foundation. He doesn't apologize for who he is. He doesn't beg to be let in. He walks into a room expecting respect, not because he's arrogant, but because he knows what it costs to earn it. And that kind of confidence makes fragile gatekeepers panic. Because if someone like that gets to belong, what does that say about them? If you've ever worked your way up from nothing, through grit, not connections, you've probably met people like this. The kind who smile through their discomfort while quietly signaling you're not one of us. And maybe you've learned over time that being true to yourself in those spaces is its own form of power. Gatekeeping thrives on insecurity, but authenticity threatens that. Because once people stop needing permission to belong, the whole illusion starts to crumble. At the heart of it all, this story is about dignity. Not pride, not ego, not fame, but the quiet, unshakable sense of worth that no gatekeeper, brand, or bias can take away. When McGregor walked out of that dealership, he didn't need to yell. He didn't need to prove himself. The moment had already spoken for itself and for countless others who have stood in rooms where they weren't wanted. It was a quiet act of resistance, to leave head held high, knowing that someone else's ignorance does not define you. This is what many of us learn, sometimes too late in life. That external validation, though intoxicating, is always conditional. That some people will never accept your presence no matter how hard you've worked or how far you've come. And that chasing their approval can quietly dismantle your self-respect. But dignity, that's yours always. It's what shows up when you're underestimated, when you're overlooked, when you're mislabeled. It's what reminds you, I know who I am, and I don't need your confirmation to exist fully. In midlife, this lesson becomes clearer. You've been through enough to know the difference between attention and respect, between being tolerated and being seen, between surface-level praise and deep human recognition, and you start to ask yourself more meaningful questions. What am I still trying to prove, and to whom? The Ferrari incident was never just about a car. It was about confronting a culture that still ranks people based on outdated images of worth. It was about exposing the uncomfortable truth that status doesn't guarantee respect, and that sometimes the people who seem to have it all still get treated like outsiders. But maybe that's the turning point. Maybe we stop trying to fit into rooms that ask us to shrink. Maybe we stop performing for approval we don't need. Maybe we start defining success not by what we can buy, but by how firmly we can stand in who we are. And maybe, just maybe, we stop being surprised when the underdog doesn't just enter the room, but owns it.